Gulf Photo Plus in Dubai. Besides photography, Karen's recent work spans across lens-based media, sculpture, and installation. She received her bachelor's in mass media with a major in journalism from St. Xavier's University in Mumbai and has an MFA in Fine Arts from Parsons School of Design in New York. Karen will be an artist in residence at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Arts in 2022. She currently teaches photography with the Josephine Herrick Project in New York. And in 2022, Karen will be teaching documentary photography at the International Center of Photography and Media Theory at New York University. Today, this is the 7th edition of the Indian Photo Festival, and I welcome Karen for the Artist's Talk. Karen, all over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Can you hear me clearly?
Absolutely.
Hi, everyone. I'm currently in New York. I just like to thank the Indian Photo Festival for inviting me to talk about my work. I was a bit hesitant at first. I don't particularly enjoy talking about my work, but I thought this was a good moment for me to look back at what I've done, where I've been, and where I'm going. So how I'm going to go through this talk is not share a particular project, but go over the trajectory of from the time when I started. I grew up in Mumbai, and I did my undergrad in mass media and majored in journalism. I initially thought I wanted to be a writer, but I had one photography class, which is when I started to realize that I really enjoyed making photographs. I don't have a romantic story about a parent giving me an old camera. I actually didn't have a camera to do any of my assignments in class. So a professor very kindly gave me his old Nikon F2, which I started shooting with, but I couldn't really afford film at the time. And so for many months I begged and pleaded, and my parents finally gave in, and which I knew was a big expense for them. And they bought me a small Canon point and shoot. It might have been 3 or 4 megapixels. And that was back in 2005 or 2006. I kind of built my portfolio just taking photos around Mumbai like everyone else did at the time, mostly looking at it, as a hobby or something that I did on the side. After I graduated, I wanted to leave home and go as far away as possible. And I borrowed some money from my parents. I had an aunt in Dubai. I had a friend's family that lived there, and I used that as an excuse to go look for a job. In a way, I guess I was following in the footsteps of many people from my family from Goa who had all moved to the Gulf to find jobs, to make money, to send money back home, something that my father had also done when he moved to Bahrain before the Gulf War to work. And so I ended up in Dubai, and luckily a newspaper called the Gulf News was looking for a young photographer. And I guess I happened to be at the right place in the right time. I got hired as a junior photographer, and this was back in 2007 when I'd never really used a DSLR. I didn't know what a flash was or what it did. That job kind of helped me learn as I went. I spent about 4.5 years working there, shooting everything from daily news to car crashes to concerts to iftars to sports and everything in between. It was an interesting starting point for me to learn about the news. I didn't have much experience before I had moved there. And so, while I was there, I was sort of introduced to different ways of working and what it meant to be in a newspaper, what it meant to collaborate with writers and journalists and, be at the right place at the right time. And for the most part, I used to be at assignments where I was, the only woman photographer. Over the few years that I was there, I started to see, a few more women, but there were maybe a handful that I would see across the country during those 4.5 years that I worked in the UAE. I was about 22, maybe. I moved there when I was 20. I was about 22 when I started working on this project, feeling dissatisfied with the repetition of certain news assignments that I was doing on a day-to-day basis. I started I found out about camel races that were happening across the country. And it was about the time when the UAE was using child jockeys, and they had just phased that out because it was deemed to be a human rights violation because many children had died or were injured during these races, and so they transitioned to using electric jockeys that were battery powered, and so the locals that owned these camels would drive alongside the camels during the races and operate the battery or the whip that was on top of the camel. And a lot of the workers that actually took care of these camels that were priced at extremely high sums of money came from Afghanistan or Pakistan or Sudan, and they were brought in to work with the camels to train them to race, to transport them and take care of them. And they lived out in little camps in the deserts that were spread across the UAE. And so I think between the ages of about 22 to 24, I was kind of slowly trying to work on the story with another friend of mine. I found a mural somewhere in the middle of nowhere that kind of represented what when child jockeys were being used very regularly in camel racing. This was I think I would say kind of my first time when I started to explore this idea of working on a feature or working on a story a little longer than my news assignments, which were very sort of spot news. I would go somewhere, I would photograph something, I would file images from the field, or like rush back to the office, upload my photos. It went into the newspaper and I was done for the day. I'd not been to photo school, so I didn't know that this was called a feature, and it was called a long-term project, of however we photographers tend to term these things. I never ended up publishing any of these photographs, but it really allowed me to work on something a little more in depth, and allowed me to spend time on something outside of my newspaper work. While I was there, this was about the end of 2008. I'd already been in Dubai for about a year or two. There's a bunch of us in the newspaper that we worked at. It was around 2008 when the Gaza war started, and I guess it came to be known as Operation Cast Lead, and there were about 1,500 Palestinians that were killed during that conflict. A bunch of us came together to use our art to raise money for the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund, which provided prosthetic limbs for children that had lost their limbs during the war. And for anyone who has the means, I highly recommend supporting them as they continue to do the same work all these years later. This was the time I think I was also starting to question, my role as a photojournalist and what the stories I was doing, what kind of impact these stories had. I knew also at the time I started to learn that press freedom was not something that was allowed working in the UAE. And there were always rumors of stories around the labor camps. There was rumors about protests and all kinds of human rights violations that we weren't allowed to report on. Towards the end of my time there, when I started to feel like it was time for me to move on to something else, I decided to work on a little side project where I realized, I can photograph these stories myself. I learned about a group of 20 Bangladeshi construction workers who were abandoned at a labor camp in an industrial area in Sharjah through a charity group called Adopt a Camp, which was run by a lovely Pakistani woman. And Gulf Photo Plus came on board and offered their support. We borrowed a bunch of little point and shoot cameras from friends and family, and the woman introduced me. Sahir, she took me to the labor camp where these men were abandoned. They were living there for almost a year without electricity, without running water. Their passports were taken away by their employer, who had vanished and left the country. And these workers were, they're trying to send money back home, and they had no work. I thought I might use, that time to raise some money. And so I gave them a bunch of cameras. They took photos of their daily lives, and we ended up doing an exhibition of the photographs that they took. which was an interesting exercise for me to realize that sometimes, I figured that it was a way for me to also step back from that role of a photographer. We sold a lot of prints and posters. All the men were at the exhibition. The men decided to use the money as they would like. Some of them sent money back home. Some of them used it to get legal help. Many of them were offered jobs after this happened. I kind of saw this as my closing chapter for when I decided to leave Dubai and move to India. I saved up some money while I was working there, and I traveled for a little bit, and I decided I would go back to India, but I was, I guess, quite naive and didn't know how things worked there because I'd left when I was straight out of college, and moving back, I didn't know how things had changed. I didn't know how I would be making money and what I would be doing. And so when I moved back to Bombay, I went back to live with my parents, and I realized there was no work. I didn't know how to find a job. I couldn't find any jobs as a photographer at any of the newspapers. And one of the reasons for also me leaving Gulf News was I felt like I wanted to spend more time working on stories that I felt passionate about instead of only doing daily sort of news work. And so when I moved back to India, one of my friends told me about, suggested that I go to Niamgiri and photograph the Dongra tribe was fighting against the British mining company Vedanta. She put me in touch with a local filmmaker who had been documenting, state violence and intimidation against the tribe there. And so I traveled to Orissa, on my own and lived with a local filmmaker who put me in touch with local activists and organizers. And I traveled to the Niamgiri Hills and spent, about a week there. And this was the first time that the Supreme Court was allowing the tribe to decide for themselves whether they wanted the mining company to mine their sacred hill. And so there were Gram Sabhas that were being held across around 102 villages over the span of several weeks. And so for a few days, I went from village to village. There was I was not prepared for not having any electricity. I was not prepared. I had 4 to 5 batteries that were fully charged. But that was it, and I didn't know how I was, that was going to last. It was a naive mistake on my part. I had to really reserve, the number of photos that I could take, and it was cold, and my batteries were running out fast. But it was kind of, I think, my first interaction with this kind of observing firsthand kind of intimidation by the police and the state. In this situation, and I was there without a press card. I was being questioned by the police, and people were questioning why I was there, especially as a woman. Why is a woman being able to walk in these forests alone? I was accused of being a Maoist, and all of these things kind of bubbled up over a few days while I'd initially decided to stay, through as long as my batteries would last, I suppose. At some point, another journalist and I were intimidated into leaving and not continuing to document the rest of the Gram Sabhas. I think this was like a moment for me where I realized the kind of stories that I wanted to focus on and the kind of work that I wanted to do. And, I was very grateful to be allowed to be a part of this process. I struggled a long time to have these photos published. I probably sent them out to maybe 20 newspapers or more, both national and international publications. And there was, no interest. I finally managed after months to have some of the images published in the Sunday Guardian, and then Al Jazeera had a digital magazine at the time that also published them. But over the last sort of, between 2012, when I moved back to India, 2011, it was about maybe 24, and I was still trying to figure out my way. Everything was through trial and error, talking to other photographers, learning on the go. I feel like I was a very slow learner looking back, trying to, take every little step. How do I pitch a story? How do I propose something? Do I follow up with an editor? How do I find editors' emails? A lot of these things that sometimes are given to you when you go to photo school or you do a master's program. These were all things I had to keep kind of figuring out just by asking and looking at the internet. And so, over the years, I was grateful that every now and then I started to get assignments from publications that were kind of aligned with what I wanted to do. And some of them were interesting. I got to work with interesting journalists and meet interesting people. So between 2012 and 2019, and it was a struggle. I'm not going to romanticize the life of being a photographer, especially a freelance photographer. There were times when there was no work for months. I had to borrow money from friends to pay rent. But there came a time over a few years where between sort of in the last few years, where I started to get regular work. I was less concerned. I came to a point where I could sometimes say no to some work if it didn't fully align with my values, the kind of work that I wanted to do. But I found there was always a struggle with working with international publications and the kind of gaze that was expected to be replicated for a Western audience. And as hard as it is to turn that lens on yourself, I had to start questioning who I was photographing for. And I didn't really find enough venues or platforms in India that was interested in publishing the work that I was doing. There was no way to get Indian newspapers and magazines and actually assigning, or at least I couldn't find those jobs. So I always questioned why the work I was doing was always being seen by the West. I mean, when those are the stories that I wanted people in my country to see first, not just a Western audience. And that struggle kind of continued with this, the story. I managed to get a grant from the International Women's Media Foundation about, young girls in Haryana who came from really poor families, sometimes Adivasi families, but who were really excelling at sports. And a lot of them were, despite the poverty and, lack of infrastructure and support, were winning at the Olympics and the Asian Games and all kinds of international tournaments. There were a lot of themes of poverty and nutrition and patriarchal norms around even what girls wearing shorts while playing football. And while that was a story that it was the first time that I got a fairly big grant to spend time working on the story and spend a few weeks without worrying about the amount of money I was spending, where I was staying, how I would get there. And for many years, that was a big concern for me in India. I kept investing in my own stories, and it was not financially sustainable after a while to not sort of make that money back or even cut even. And that was my first big grant that I got. And while I really enjoyed working on the story, and I did again start to think, was that also me getting that grant, did that mean that I was kind of making work that fit the West idea of India, women in India, girls in India, which is a repetitive trope that is very easy to fall into. For a couple of years, I had a contract with Bloomberg News, and I photographed for them regularly. Not entirely assignments that I would have chosen if I had the option to say no to. But it was a way to kind of pay my bills and do the work and continue being in the industry. I was lucky to be able to travel a fair bit as well across Asia for some assignments. Through all of this, I think I kind of came to this point where I started feeling like I wanted to keep doing what I was doing, but I think I had that same moment after 5 or 6 years of freelancing that I had when I was leaving Dubai. And I thought, I had so many existential questions about where I was, what I was doing, how I was doing it, what I was thinking about. I had more to say, and I felt like doing documentary photography at that time felt limiting for me, and I wanted to express myself in other ways. In 2016, I was accepted into the Chennai Photo Biennale's workshop. I started working on the story in a small fishing community in the north of Chennai called Kasimede. And I decided to take a little different approach than doing strictly documentary photojournalistic work. There was no larger story here. A local friend who's also a photographer took me to this little community where all the men were working as fishermen and the women would sell the fish in the market. And I decided to collaborate with the kids in this community, and I started to talk to them and ask them about their relationship to the ocean and to the water, and they had all these very fantastical stories about the sea and creatures that lived beneath it, and they talked about the ghosts of all the little turtles that came there and that were killed by the fishing boat motors. They collected things that came out of the ocean. Some of them were very scared of the water, some of them were extremely good swimmers. And so I decided to use that as a jumping off point and like a point of departure, I guess, to photograph the story. While there's no larger narrative, it kind of felt liberating to let go of the idea of a sort of linear narrative. I kind of looked at it as fiction or fantasy in a way, and used their. I collaborated with them and had them do little drawings of their dreams, of their nightmares of the ocean, and all of them had very interesting. All of them dreamt of the ocean at some point or the other. Funnily, a lot of them also had nightmares of the tsunami, even though many of them were so young they weren't even born when the tsunami had happened. So it was very interesting for me learning to look at a story in a way that I've not been able to do before. So some of the images. I felt, with this way that I was working, I couldn't see this fitting into a newspaper. This was naturally something that would be published, like considering the work that I'd done before. So it was an interesting take for me to kind of think about, okay, what do these images mean, and how do they kind of fit into the larger body of work that I was working on. In 2018, I got a little commission from the Serendipity Arts Photo Festival with 3 other women photographers, and we were allowed to choose the stories that we wanted to work on that would be exhibited at the festival. And I read about Lakshmi Kuttiyamma, who I think it was News Minute, there was a little article about her, kind of a profile about her life, and there were just words. There was no photos, and I was fascinated by the work she was doing. She was a poet. She was a poison healer, a natural medicine woman. She belonged to the Kani tribe and lived in the Ponmudi Hills a few hours outside of Trivandrum in Kerala. I got in touch with local activists and journalists who put me in touch with her, and I went with a friend and colleague who helped me translate from Malayalam and helped us converse with each other. I spent a couple of weeks over 2 trips, spending time living with Amma and photographing her surroundings. She had only studied until 4th standard, but she spent her lifetime writing poetry. I photographed some of her poems and had them translated later to English, that were also part of the exhibition at Serendipity Arts Festival. These are on my website if you want to read through them. I'm going to rush past it. It was, for me, this was an interesting time in being in a place that was, very focused on like sounds and senses, and sort of times of day, everything rotated around nature. When you woke up and you went to bed, the sounds of the birds or the insects, the rain. There was nothing spectacular to photograph, and that idea of that spectacular that runs through the documentary tradition, where every image has to be something that wows you. I tried to let go of that idea, and was okay to be interested in like the smaller moments while I was spending time here. Again, these poems are all also on my website. This was also about the time where I was wondering where this would be photographed. Where this would be published. And I recorded a bunch of sounds while I was working on the story. There were sounds of the forest, of the stream nearby. I recorded sounds of, Amma singing her traditional songs, the sound of her little battery operated radio. And I used that as a sound piece that played in the room where the images were exhibited. I'm not going to make you listen to the whole thing. I might just skip forward. This was about the time when I started to. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so this was, I think, about the time when I started, thinking more materially about how I can incorporate other elements outside of photography using text or using sound or, objects and other materials. Also, I didn't know if I could publish this work, but at some point, many months later, this work was, these photographs were published in the Caravan, and I got a very curious email that, for all purposes could have been spam or maybe is. And just as a disclaimer, this was in no way representative of my support of the Congress Party or Rahul Gandhi. But I got this email that, came at a time when I was really wondering who was looking at these images. I felt like I kept putting out photographs, and maybe all of us have these questions as photographers: is, how do you track impact at some point or the other? Do you keep doing this? And maybe there's no sort of reason to despair in some of these things. You just do the work. But I did start to have, my existential crisis again that I had, back when I was leaving Gulf News. And this is not to say that I had anything to do with this, but the year after, Lakshmi became, I was given the Padma Shri Award, and I'm not sure if that came with any kind of cash money, but there was a point where I was starting to wonder, I left Amma, I'd spent time with her, I made photographs, and what was I leaving behind? She was still going to struggle and live the life that she was living. She was struggling for money. She still had to wake up every day and collect firewood and come back. And she was old and she was living by herself, and there was not much support. All of these questions are, kind of irritating me for a long time. This came at a time when I thought, okay, I started to realize, well, I actually don't really know who's reading these stories and who's seeing these photographs and who's, what kind of impact it has, but you just do it in the sense of some hope that you can continue, maybe, changing some minds or having people look at the work and act in ways that maybe you don't have any way to follow up on or track. And there have been many times where people have come forward to help. A lot of people that I photographed through monetary support or through offering support through like infrastructure or resources or offering jobs. So there were times when it felt a little hopeful doing what you were doing. All of these questions led me to this project a couple of years ago. My work, as a woman photographer, and through the experiences that I had, I was, struggling with this idea of not being able to feel at ease when I was in public spaces. The tradition of street photography is largely kind of taken over by men. It's always, men that are celebrated as these very revered street photographers. But I thought I was also making photographs in the street, but I would not be, really called a street photographer. And some of the questions that I had with that was, I always felt like I wanted to be outside and not have a purpose and not be questioned about why I was there. I had to have a certain body language. I had to have certain reason for being where I was. And through the years of freelancing, and I'm sure women, face this, but while on the job, there have been so many instances of harassment. I've had people come to my hotel room, knock on my door, there's all kinds of harassment everywhere you go across the country. And so this brought me to a point where I decided to turn the camera towards myself. I decided to dress as a man in passing, and I use that little liberally, because we're not really using the language of gender and sexuality in India that the West is using at the moment. But for the purpose of this project, I'm just going to say as a man. And I would photograph myself really doing nothing. I had the help of two friends who are also amazing photographers who helped me photograph this. I studied kind of the body language that men were using in public spaces, the ways in which they could be outside and in parts of the city where I wouldn't have, I would not try to find myself in alone, regardless of the time of day or night. And so I decided to capture these moments where I knew if I was doing these specific things where I was dressed and visibly looking like a woman, I would definitely be stared at. Someone would sing songs at me, someone would call out to me, someone would stand around and watch what I was doing. And all of these things, I started to think about, what it meant to be in a certain body in a public space in India. And well, this is both these images are all photographed. Some are in Bombay and some are in Bangalore. And thought of them as very quiet moments that I wanted to be in. If I was having a bad day, I wanted to just go to a park and take a nap, but I couldn't find myself doing that alone. And largely, I think, there's obviously a class conversation here to be had and a caste conversation to be had as well. But these are some of the things that I was thinking about when I came to this point when I started to work on this project. I think this is where my chapter again shifted, and I decided I wanted to kind of do something different, which is when I applied to do a master's program in New York. I feel like I need to take a little pause from doing photo work and sort of reorient myself and reset my thinking around photography and my being as a photographer. Luckily, I got a couple of scholarships, and I came to New York in September of 2019 to do a master's in fine arts at Parsons. And that's when I kind of put my camera down for a little bit and decided to shift my thinking around still, working with images, but not as a photographer. Some of these when I started to work more materially, I started to, learn how to work with wood and metal and plaster. And I wanted to have a more sort of tangible form of, of working with images. And I started to use found images with this project that was sort of two-part project that I worked on was UV prints on steel. I sheared the steel myself, and they found sort of images, cutouts of bodies that are meant to be suggesting doing certain actions, but that maybe the lack of resolution and the shifting of pixels changes our perception of how we're looking at images. And with these two, they're kind of installed on walls facing each other. So there's the idea of the spectator and the gaze, and you as a viewer being in between those two spaces and what you're looking at, or what who's looking at you, and how that changes our perception of looking at images. This is something that I worked on recently. It's just a kind of a prototype and not a final work. There are images, there are hundreds and hundreds of images of sites of terror and conflict and war. And they're layered and printed on rice paper. So there's an opacity to the material itself, and then the images adds for the layer to what's on the surface. And they're meant to resemble, maybe kind of tabs on a screen. And with these, I was thinking of the kind of, motifs and symbols that are repeated in the way sites of conflict are depicted or represented. Certain colors started to come up. Things are very brown in certain parts of the world. Things are more blue in other parts of the world. And it's not, of course, it reflected the geography of the place, but there were, very repeated motifs of barbed wire and, barricades and bombed out buildings and burning cars and, military uniforms and fists raised in the air, or, groups of people running away from something. And so that kind of thinking for me came from this idea of, how do we photograph certain places, and how are we repeating certain kinds of tropes? And I was a question I was also struggling with in my own, practice. This is a series of cyanotypes that I worked on recently. With these, I was thinking of the idea of fragmentation. For, the first one on the extreme left, I used cow bones and cow feet and soil and rocks and the 24 spokes that look like spokes falling from the sky or look pointy. Are the 24 spokes from the chakra on the Indian flag. I used the burlap, which is used, the jute bags, which I used, as military barricades of protection. The body, the torso's size to my body, where I used salt. There's a fragmented lotus and soil. And all of these sort of point to, where I guess we are right now in India and what that idea of the nation state means. And wherever these objects sit on the paper is, actually the place where the sun cannot reach or the light cannot reach. And I was thinking of using that as a metaphor for, what this current moment means in the blueprint of this country. I started to work, a lot more materially, thinking about time and how things are ephemeral, and also the idea of a line and a border, and how there's, how a line can act as something that holds something in, and that's also leaves something out, in relation to the idea of a nation state. We need a border to have a sense of belonging and know where we are, but that border also helps government and politics to define who stays out of it. I created this large sculpture that I suspended, and that sat on the ground. This was part of my thesis exhibition a few months ago. So this kind of change in my work has been very interesting for me materially. I finally feel very excited about the place I'm in right now, with working with materials, working with my hands, still thinking about images and that gap that lies in, documentary photography and this representation of ideas and people and places. And I feel like I'm in a place where I'm trying to make sense of that gap and sort of link things between images and objects. Again, this, the use of everyday materials. It's a very, very long title, but the title also comes from the idea of the caption, the covering of the who, what, where, when, how, but the why is always missing in a caption, and there are always reasons for that. But that's what I was playing on here. All of these objects have traditionally been used to protect protesters from tear gas attacks across the world, and a lot of these, most of the things have been used, barring one. But I think that's where the question kind of comes in the title. This is an installation I made with using razor blades that maps the India-Pakistan border along Kashmir. So yeah, I think this is kind of where I am now, and I'm not yet at a turning point in my work, like I was when I left Dubai and left Mumbai. But I'm pretty much enjoying exploring the work that I'm doing, and also getting back to photography after 2.5 years of COVID and online schooling. I just want to, I want to take a moment to just remember Danish, and who was a friend and mentor and colleague to many of us. And I hope that we can kind of continue doing the work that he was doing in the same spirit. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. That was thank you for taking us through your journey and also all the questions that you asked yourself. One of the questions that you kept repeating, I think, is, how is India seen or represented in the West, and were you falling into the trap? What conclusion did you come to with that? And, how do you make India be seen as an Indian and not, something for the West?
I don't know that I have an answer to that, because I noticed like there's a lot of Indian photographers who also replicate the same way of photographing that a Westerner photographs India, and I feel like that requires you to not question the geopolitics or the caste and class politics of India when you come in as a foreigner. And that's what a lot of, I think, Indian photographers also end up falling into that trap, because I think that kind of view requires you to really question your place as a photographer and the kind of stories you're putting out. And that means that you can't go in any kind of detail, because the Western audience is not really interested in learning about caste divides, or they're not interested in the specifics of a story. And maybe for fair reason, that's just the view. But I don't know that I know how to change that. I feel like that's a question to ask the American publications for the most part.
All right. And when you said you were photographing Kadal, um, um, you had 20 rejections, and you didn't know where to send your photograph or how to keep pitching it, etc. But how did you, like, I mean, 20 is quite a lot. Yeah, how did you keep going at it, and how did you finally arrive at it being published?
I had to pay rent. That was the only reason I kept sending out. No, but I mean, besides, jokes apart, like I did want, the story to be seen. I didn't want these images. I feel like I had some responsibility to the people that gave me their time and allowed me to live with them and spend time with them. And it was a story that was important, not just in India, but, across the world. And that was something I constantly faced. Even after I got the grant to do the Play Like a Girl story in Haryana, I started keeping a track of the number of pitches I sent, and I have an Excel sheet, and I'm sure I can find it, of almost 38 to 40 emails that I sent out to different publications. And I had it published maybe 3 or 4 times out of that. So the success rate of pitching and emailing is more work than the actual photographing itself.
Wow. Okay, so we didn't. Everybody who wants to start documentary photography needs to keep that in mind. I think in another interview you've said that if you want to be a documentary photographer, then you've got to know that you will not make too much money in the beginning, or maybe later. So were you also doing something else at that point of time, or was it just photography?
I was only doing photography. And I have to say that, a lot of people don't talk about how they support themselves doing this work. A lot of, some photographers have support from their families or spouses or partners, which, I haven't had since I was, 20. And so I have to say that while I was doing, assignment and news work, I would take on some commercial work. I would take on anything that came to me, honestly, because there was really no way to make much money in journalism. I had bills to pay. I had to save money. I had, a life to continue, and the way to do that was to take on commercial work.
Right. And when you were doing the story of Niyamgiri, you said you were intimidated into moving out. But you stayed before that, I think, for quite a bit. Were you scared while you were there? And how did you, decide that this is it? We must leave now.
There were times when I would hear from other people, other activists, journalists that were with us, who would it's a whisper network. This word passed around from different villages, and I heard from other people, or they told me that the police or the military that was there was targeting you because they couldn't place you, or they didn't know who you were, why you were there, especially as a woman, because I was the only woman journalist there, trying to attend all those gram sabhas and walking through those forests. And I didn't have a press card, so I was told to always stay close to the activists that I was with for safety. At some point, I don't know, all these whispers kind of got louder during one of the gram sabhas, but there was a really high police presence. And it was me and another journalist who was documenting sort of, human rights issues in these tribal communities. We were both told that we should both leave for our own safety.
Right. And you then went. I think one of the last photography projects was Stand Like a Man. Are you going outside? Sorry. And how how do you feel about being a woman photographer, and what all have you had to navigate to doing the stories that you want to do, that you wouldn't, or that is just privilege, that is just like accepted for men, let's say that?
I think this has happened, from the beginning. I feel like I wouldn't, if it was a story that required, I don't know, it was a tense situation, or if it was something that required too much physical ability, it was, I think, assumed that that assignment would go to a man. Even just being able to be outside and just hang out with my camera, I couldn't, a man, guy could do that in certain parts of India if you're hanging out in UP or, Bihar or even Delhi, maybe. You could do that more easily as a man than you could as a woman. So I think they're very small things that I don't know that men entirely are aware of the fact of the kind of things that we can't do and that we can't take for granted. It's the act of standing at a corner and waiting for something with your camera. It's really basic, but the amount of anxiety, and maybe I wasn't really good at putting that aside and not feeling the fear or feeling tense. But that was definitely my experience a lot.
Was there a point where you said, okay, I have found my voice, this is what I want to do? Or when and how did you find your voice, if there is such a thing as a voice?
I don't know about this voice. My voice keeps changing every few years. So I don't know if I trust my voice. I feel like I have a shake up every few years and I have to do something else. So I don't know if it's my, struggle with committing or with committing to a certain way of working. But I like that I enjoy when that process is, it's frightening and a little scary because you've seen how much the work has changed over the years. So maybe, I don't know whether there's a voice there and I don't know what that means. I don't know if that's even important to have like one voice that's just doesn't have to be a visual thread. I think I have a voice in the way I think about things, but maybe not in an entirely sort of photographic visual language sense.
Right. And you've been using images on different medium as an artist, as a sculptor as well, so as an installation artist. So how have you how did these, could you tell us a little bit about those to begin with?
Right. I think, yeah, can you elaborate, like, as in what did you mean by how?
Because you've used cyanotype, you've used UV on steel. How did you decide to use these? Why did they come to you, and how did you think the image how did it present differently to you as an artist when you use these?
Right. I think at this this point it was nice for me to just put down the camera, and I think a lot is like attached to this idea of being a photographer, and you're constantly expected to be in this act or this performance of a photographer. And it was a good exercise for me to think more materially, like how can these images exist on a surface beyond a print or a scene or a book. Can these images exist in other ways? Can they be interacted with? Other senses can other senses be activated through materials? So the steel or the rice paper, they have a very tangible feel. You can touch these things and feel them, and they're cold or they're warm, or they move in certain ways. And that was something, I think, working on a screen or working digitally, I didn't have that, and that was kind of what I was exploring.
All right. And to come to the age-old question of does a camera you have matter at all?
No.
Or your equipment?
I think any camera is okay, I guess, as long as you have it. I mean, of course, I'm not going to say, like, if you're doing assignment work or you're doing commercial work, you're expected to have a certain caliber of camera and pixels and quality and all of that. But if that is not a concern, I feel like I see people making amazing photos on their phones. So I wish I had a better phone.
You've also been teaching for this year, last year as well. And this year that you learn by teaching. What have you learned?
Right now, I work with a group of very, very excited, high energy middle school, teenagers. And for me, it's been interesting. I think I enjoy teaching because it's, for me, it's more learning than I think it is for the students themselves. I'm taken back to all the basics. I'm starting to question everything from the beginning. I'm learning new things as I'm teaching. I'm forced to read more. I'm forced to update my own knowledge. I'm forced to update, how I'm thinking. I need to, be up to date with everything on the internet, with social media, even though I'm not very good at that. All of this has been a good learning for me, and I enjoy the idea of, I enjoy having dialogue about these things. As you know, I have so many questions about everything, and maybe not that many answers. And so a lot of these, I think, questions get discussed in the classroom, which I think, working as a photographer and artist, you're generally so insular and working alone, where that group setting, allows me to have that kind of conversation.
That's lovely. We've got some questions from the audience. We've got one from Anurag Mishra, who says, thank you for narrating your journey. And key to photography is the inspiration. What has been your inspiration to continue every day?
It's been my inspiration to continue every day. That's a lifelong question. I think for me, I need to be excited about what I'm doing. I really need to feel close to what I'm thinking about and what I want to start working. Over the years, I've worked on projects where I was half-hearted about it. I wasn't fully committed to it, and that always showed in the outcome. And so I feel like, now I've really started to pay attention to my instinct. If something doesn't feel right, I let it sit aside for some time and come back to it later. But I allow myself to just read as much as possible. I feel like if there's a direct answer to what is the inspiration, is to try to read and consume as much art and cinema and books as I can.
And as a journalist, you were a photojournalist for a newspaper for 4.5 years. Did you ever feel you've said in an earlier interview that you wanted to write as well. Did you ever feel that you wanted to write at any point, or were words important at all?
I'd say yes. I did write a few stories, but they were usually, stories that I wrote in conjunction with my photographs. But I was essentially, writing stories that I wasn't photographing for. So I feel like now I want to write more. I, have ideas for a book that I want to work on that's maybe not going to have any images, but will be about photography. So I do find myself drawn to writing, and I think that's part of my practice. I try to write whenever I can, even if it's a diary entry. So I think hopefully it'll be part of what I do in the future.
Oops, we have a question from Ritesh Uttam Chandani, who says you've always been one of his favorite photographers. And when working with found photos, especially maybe like the ones of sites of terror, conflict, how do you manage copyright issues, if any?
Yeah, this question comes up quite a bit now, from photographers and photojournalists. I think of it as collage. I'm not using anyone's images as my work. It's not being passed as this photograph is my work. Along the lines of what I guess Richard Prince would do. I look at it as collage as the act of maybe cutting out images from a magazine, or as photographers, we photograph architecture, we photograph sculptures in public, we photograph statues, we photograph film posters, we photograph a lot of artwork that we don't own copyrights to. So I feel like that question is, there's gaps there in both the question and the answer.
Right. And what about model releases and things like that? Is that something that you've had to work with all the time, or Do you always have them when you were working as a documentary photographer?
No, we don't, I don't think we use model releases in India very much unless it's commercial work. I think for journalistic work, it would be a bit strange to telling people that they're models and that they need to release themselves to us. But I've had to use model releases only for commercial work when there were actors or there were regular people who were playing, their part in a role that was maybe more advertising or PR and that wasn't journalistic.
Right. We have this question every time, and we still want to know the answer, which is, what is your advice for emerging photographers, and what would be the one thing you wish you had known, and you do now?
I wish someone would have told me that you can't make a living doing this. Not everyone can. So yeah, I think I have a different source of income that supports you. I think that allows you to also not to compromise the kind of work that you can take on, and maybe stay true to that voice that we were talking about that doesn't have to be questioned every time. So I wish someone had told me that early on. Also, I wish someone had told me that I need to read more early on. So I'm still trying to catch up on my reading for not reading in my early 20s.
Right. And a follow-up question to that from Ritesh is that, what is your advice to oldies like us, he says, or more established photographers?
I think the oldies need to be funding the young photographers.
Have they made enough money to do so? You mentioned that you wish you'd read more. Are there any books that you'd like to recommend that you think everybody should at least have read once?
Can look at my books. I don't know that I recommend anything in particular. I guess maybe some, over the last few years, I've started to reread more photo theory. So I kind of reread all of Sontag's work, and I would say I think Judith Butler's Frames of War was very interesting for me. I don't know that there's specific books that I can suggest. There are things that I'm interested in, so I feel like I'm drawn to more nonfiction. Theory around trauma and conflict and nation states, but that just helps my thinking around my work. So I feel like people need to just find their interests and just just explore more about what's exciting them.
All right, so not necessarily photography, but anything that's that they're concerned with.
Yeah, don't read about photography.
All right, thank you so much, Karen, for giving us your time, for taking us through your journey. Where we can find you on Instagram at Karen Dias, or Diastopia, I think.
I'm at Diastopia, Diastopia. It's the world we're living in.
Right, and you're also on your websites are.
My website is karendiasphotography.com, and my sort of studio work is on karendias.studio.
All right, thank you. The Indian Photo Festival continues. We've got another 2 conversations coming up over the next few days. And the exhibitions continue in Hyderabad till December 19th at both the State Art Gallery and at KBR Park. So whoever's in Hyderabad, please do come and see them. Thank you again, Karen. Thank you
so much.
Yeah. Thank you and good night.